Hey you guys, it's my Flickers of Fear movie review show, and it's the second movie of what I'm calling Folk Horror February. As I mentioned on the last couple of shows, some months this year I decided I was going to do more of a theme just to make things easier, like for me to pick movies, because I have such a big list and sometimes it's hard to like sort out which ones I want to do. So this month, in celebration of the recent documentary that Shudder just added, which is all about folk horror, I decided that it was a genre I wanted to get more into because there's like a bunch of other folk horror movies that I'd wanted to talk about, and I thought this was as good a time as any. Now, the one that we're talking about today, this one is kind of an anomaly actually, because I kind of feel like this is called Eyes of Fire. It came out in 1983. I think it has an alternate title, Cry Blue Sky, although I don't think I've ever seen it called that. This is a movie that seemed like for a long time sort of slipped under the radar. And I think that for years and years, it was almost like one of those movies that sometimes, like if you saw it on VHS, like back in the old days, and then it just kind of went out of print and everyone sort of forgot about it. And then it seems like recently it's gone through a little bit of a revival. I guess, as I said, because in the last few years, folk horror is kind of, with The Witch and Midsummer and things like that. So I kind of feel like people are getting more interested in folk horror as a genre. So, this one's sort of gotten like rediscovered a little bit. Now, interestingly, I actually didn't know this when I watched the documentary on Shudder, but Severin Films, I believe, has just put out this massive limited edition box set that has like 20 different folk horror movies. It has like a big book. It has the documentary that's also on Shudder, and it just has like all these kind of more obscure folk horror movies from around the world. And Eyes of Fire is one of the ones that's on there. And Shudder also added like a handful, a selection that was also in this box set, which is how I got interested in it, because I said, oh, this is really interesting because this is a movie. It's an American film, but I had never actually heard of it. Like when I looked at the title, I thought to myself, well, I might have seen that cover at the video store at some point, but for whatever reason, I just never rented it. Maybe I thought it wasn't scary enough, or it wasn't, I don't really know like what the reason would have been, because I rented most horror movies back then. But I do kind of feel like in the 80s, I was more into like slasher type stuff. So this is definitely not a slasher. So it's maybe that's why I never ended up watching it. But this is kind of an interesting film. So it has actually been released, restored and released. But for a long time, all you could get, and I don't even think, like, the movie came out in 83, and I don't even think the VHS came out until 87. And then it was out for a few years, and then it sort of went into print, like out of print. And then it didn't even get put out on Blu-ray until just like a month ago. Seriously, I think it was like early December 2021. So so this is kind of like a movie that really, you couldn't even see it for a long time except on like shitty VHS or like foreign transfers and things like that. But it has been restored now, and it looks really nice. So this movie is an American folk horror movie, which you don't really see a lot of. So it's a period piece. It's set in 1750, kind of in, I guess it's in like the Northeast Pennsylvania or somewhere like that type of area, like prior to the Revolutionary War. So there's a lot of kind of stuff about Shawnee Indians. There's a lot of kind of stuff about Scots-Irish immigrants to the area that are bringing kind of their own European folk magic to it. So it's all that kind of stuff. Now, I will say, even though if you're into folk horror, I think this is definitely worth watching, but there are some kind of things about it that I didn't love, but it's still like a fascinating movie. I didn't really read a lot about it prior to watching it because I was just kind of curious to see what was going to happen with it. I knew that it was set in 1750 and that it was about these, these settlers that like went in the woods and like bad shit ensued. That was like pretty much it. But it's like a really interesting, I was going to say they don't make movies like this anymore. They didn't make movies like this back then either. And it's like really, really hard to put my finger on. I don't know. It's just a strange movie. Like the pacing is kind of strange, and I don't know, but I found it like really interesting. I really liked the lore behind it, and actually the monster design in it, like the monster, looked pretty cool. So this was directed by a guy named Avery Crounce. Now, I think that this is one of only 3 feature films that he directed. He did one later on. I can't remember what it was called, but it was like a drama, and it had Karen Black in it. But I think he's primarily more like a photographer. He's from Kentucky, I think. So he didn't really do a lot of movies. So as I said, this one kind of like slipped under the radar. So what you have at the outset, it's almost kind of like, I don't want to say it's like a wraparound story, but the whole thing is like told in flashback. I don't know if it necessarily needed to be, but it is. So at the very beginning, there's this encampment of French soldiers, and they find this young woman, maybe late teens, early 20s, and this little girl. Their names are Fanny and Meg. And they're basically like, and they're apparently like the only survivors of whatever this tragedy was that happened. So the French soldiers are trying to get out of them, what happened to you? Where are your parents? Where are the rest of the people you were traveling with? And they then like tell the story, because they're basically like, well, Leah saved us, they say. Leah's the queen of the forest. She saved us with magic and all this other stuff. So that's kind of like setting up. So then we go back to see what happened to these 2 girls, how they ended up here. So as I said, this is set in 1750. They don't really say specifically where, but I'm assuming because it's Shawnee Indian tribe that it's somewhere around Pennsylvania, maybe Ohio, somewhere like that. That's because the tribe is Algonquin. That's the language they spoke, and that's generally where their territory was, so I'm assuming it's somewhere around there. So what happens at the very beginning, we're in this town, and apparently there's this new preacher who has come there named Will Smythe. And Will Smythe, despite being a preacher, is a little bit of a poonhound, gonna say. So he's taken up with this woman named Eloise in the town, who is actually the wife of this dude named Marion Dalton, who is a trapper, and he's gone for long periods of time. So I'm assuming like she got lonely and needed some D. So she kind of like took up with the preacher. Now the preacher also has this other woman living at his house. It's not clear. I wasn't real clear. Maybe they said this and I wasn't paying attention, but I wasn't real clear on whether that he was banging that woman too, or whether this was just like his ward. Her name is Leah, and she's Irish, and she looks totally Irish too. She's got like she's a very, very ginger. So and her hair is very big, and so I don't know. They kind of read her as like insane. You know what I mean? Or kind of, I don't know, special, insane. Now, I don't know, because he says at some point that, the townspeople were burning her mom for being a witch, but I stepped in and tried to save her, but I couldn't save her. And then I had to like take over the care of this woman's daughter and keep the townsfolk from, killing her as well as a witch. That turns out to be not entirely true. Like, that's just kind of the story that he told. So I'm assuming, because I think when I was reading the plot synopsis on Wikipedia, it was saying, he lives in this house with 2 women who he's not married to and blah, blah, blah. But I took it that Leah was like his ward, like he was taking care of her. But I never got the impression that he was sleeping with her too, but maybe I just missed that. I don't know. But the fact that he is taking up with another man's wife, even though that man is gone all the time, the townspeople aren't having it. And they decide that they are going to hang him, and maybe Eloise too, and also maybe Leah, because they think she's weird and she's like a witch. Which, spoiler alert, she is, but she's a good one. So they try to hang him, but Leah starts like chanting these weird kind of things, and the rope breaks. And then all the townspeople are like, oh, bro, okay, well, maybe God intervened or whatever. And then the preacher, Eloise, Leah, and a few other of the townsfolk that didn't like all the other townspeople, I guess, they decide they're going to get the fuck out of Dodge and go off on their own and form their own little community or whatever. So they lock all the townspeople in the barn, and then they pretty much take all their shit. Like, they take their boat and like all their supplies and stuff, which seemed like a dick move, but okay. Well, they did like try to hang him, so I guess he was like a little bitter about it. So they set off on their own to find their own Garden of Eden. I'm assuming this is kind of like a little breakaway sect Maybe Will Smythe wants to go form a cult somewhere where nobody cares if he's sleeping with other people's wives and stuff like that, I'm assuming. But he does kind of convince like a few people to go along with him, like a few couples and some kids and stuff like that. So they kind of set off on their own through what is hostile territory owned by the Shawnee Indians, and also there's kind of like some French soldiers in there too, and they don't really cotton to all these people kind of like coming through their territory and shit. So they travel for a little while, a couple of them get killed, and then they come to this place where Smythe is convinced this is where our Garden of Eden is going to be. And he figures this out because there's already like some cabins and stuff there. There's always like a little, it's not even really a village. It's just like a few cabins, but they're kind of abandoned and they're sort of like falling down. And he's like, hey, most of the work is done and we can just like fix these up and move into them. And God told us, it's God's will or whatever. But then Leah wanders off into the woods, and she finds, in what is actually quite a striking image, this part of the woods that's like all the trees and shit like that are covered with white feathers. Now, she comes back to the camp. Now, in the meantime, Eloise, the chick that was banging, that was married, that was banging the preacher, her husband has come back from his trapping, sojourn, and has come back to the town, and the town people told him, hey, your slut wife like took off with the preacher and a bunch of other people, and says where they went. So he follows along and like finds them. So he actually kind of intervenes when the little group of people are going to get killed by Indians, and it's like 2 Indians and like 3 French guys, I think. And so they're going to get killed, but then Marion comes and he intervenes, and he can speak Algonquin and various other languages. So he's basically like, don't hurt him. It's, and so he tells him a tale. So now it's super awkward because now her husband is back, and, so there's kind of like they're at loggerheads, like the husband and the preacher, because obviously, there's that whole situation. But Marion, when Leah comes back and she's all covered with white feathers, he's basically like, okay, well, this is bad. We probably shouldn't stay here because all those white feathers, that means the Shawnee Indians have put that there like to warn other people away from this area because it's cursed or haunted or whatever. But of course, the preacher is like, nah, those savages, we're not having that. This is where we're supposed to be. Everything's already here. We're staying. Now, as time goes on, they start to discover that even though in this valley where they have chosen to settle, even though they're safe from the tribes around there, because the tribes all believe, rightly, that the area is haunted, they do start to see some other kind of weird, upsetting shit happening, in the sense that, sometimes they will look out the window and see what appears to be muddy, naked people, like running around outside, and they kind of go in the woods, and some of the trees have like anguished looking faces in them. Also, something really weird turns up too. This little girl, who appears to be a little Native American child, turns up at the edge of the village and is like, hey, look how cute I am, and the preacher is like, ooh, this is another sign, like we're supposed to raise her as a Christian. And so they take her in. But Leah is not really, she doesn't really talk until later. She just kind of speaks in tongues and, and kind of like runs around in the woods. Like I said, she's kind of like a witch, but not in a witch. She's more like a nature sprite kind of person, you know what I mean? Where she's running around barefoot and like eating mud and having visions and stuff. So she's had a vision of this little Native American girl being essentially like a demon. She's like red and she has like these big yellow eyes and shit like that. So she's like, well, this is a trap and we've invaded on something's territory. Now, what this something is, they don't explain it super clearly, but there's one scene where Marion is talking to his daughter, Fanny, like around the fire, and he's very familiar with this particular area. Like he said, he speaks the languages of the tribes in the area as well, so he kind of has a peace with them because he's just a trapper. And so he says, well, this area, what a lot of the local tribes believe is that every person and animal that is killed in this area, like their blood seeps into the ground. And when enough of it seeps into the ground, it's almost like it all like gathers together like into these beings, like nature elementals, I guess maybe would be a good way of putting it. And they're not necessarily evil. They're just kind of like nature spirits, and they don't really like humans kind of fucking up their land or like disrespecting them and stuff. So so they'll come together into like these essentially elemental spirits that kind of like sprout out of the ground and will fuck you up if you're on their land. So there's that. So I think that's what all like the naked muddy people are running around. But there is also this one large being, which later on in the movie they call the Devil Witch. And I think it's played by a man, but I guess it's supposed to be, I don't know if it's supposed to be a woman. I think it's just supposed to be a monster. But it's just kind of like it's actually pretty cool. Like the monster design, it's just this big, I mean, you can see the face, and it's just like a witchy face, but it almost kind of looks like a tree person, kind of. But it's like, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It kind of reminded me of, okay, so imagine if the bum from behind Winky's Diner in Mulholland Drive was like twice that size and also kind of looked like a tree. And then you're kind of like getting what it is. So what this witch is doing apparently is trying to like capture the souls of the settlers. And when someone's soul is captured, it puts them into a tree because their face will like go into the tree. But if you know that happens and you go and like pull the person out of the tree, then they'll be okay. Because there's one scene where apparently like one of like the little Native American girl who is maybe a demon, takes one of the other little girls, I think is Meg, or I can't remember like what the other little girl's name is, but takes one of the kids into the forest, and then they find the little girl later like hanging upside down, and they think she's dead because her face is all fucked up. But then like Leah or whoever like knows that her soul is now trapped in the tree. So if you go to the tree and like fuck up that tree or pull her out of the tree, then she'll come back to life. So that's what happens. So essentially what this is kind of like a battle between the elemental spirits, that's what I'm going to call them, in this particular clearing, this particular settlement, who the settlers obviously perceive as evil because, they're trying to kill them, and Leah, who is essentially like a white witch. She's like an Irish, more like a fairy, I guess. She's a person, but she has like magical powers. Like I said, she can see the future, not that far in the future, but she does like have visions and stuff. She can move things like just by thinking about them. So it's essentially like she's trying to save the settlers from these elemental spirits that are like out in the woods. So that's pretty much the story. I don't want to spoil too much of it. If you have Shudder, you can watch it on there. It's not a terrific movie. I mean, but there's something like really kind of creepy and intriguing about it. I really do like the monster design a lot. I really like some of the shots, like particularly some of the shots of like the elemental spirits, presumably like they're all like these muddy naked people, and they're, kind of like they'll just appear in the woods, and it's like that's kind of creepy. So there's like a lot of creepy scenes in it, and I really like the lore behind it. I like the idea. I really like the imagery of like the faces in the trees, because it looks like real people, with just like trees like built around them. So that looks really cool. Like I said, the witch looks really cool. I will say though that the acting is very uneven in the sense that the guy that plays Marion Dalton, I think, is like the best one. Like he comes across the best. The other acting is kind of like hit or miss. It does seem like, and some of the accents come and go, because I kind of feel like Eloise, the woman that was, the wife that was banging the preacher, I thought she was supposed to be Irish because at first she had like a pretty pronounced Irish accent, but then as the movie went on, it kind of came and went. So there was that kind of thing. And the guy playing the preacher, his accent initially seemed British, but then it kind of like wavered. So I wasn't entirely sure, I wasn't even entirely sure if they were even supposed to have accents or if they just like forgot about them, or I don't know. So the acting was a little bit like, some of them were better than others. The kid actors, not fantastic, but what are you gonna do? It wasn't terrible. It wasn't like so bad that it was, distracting really, but it was kind of like, it was a little bit something that I noticed. The special effects are cheesy, but not bad for 1983, particularly for a movie that was presumably this low budget. And as I said, the monster design of the quote-unquote devil witch was actually really cool. And honestly, There's one shot in particular which I really dug, where the Devil Witch was like standing there, and then suddenly it's like sucks into the ground, like into the leaves and stuff like that, and it looked really cool. They might have done it in reverse, I couldn't really tell, but it looked really good. Like, it looked really fluid, like how it just, and I'm not entirely sure how they did it, but that looked really cool. So you know, it does have kind of a lot of those kind of weird, flashy, like 80s, like let's everything goes negative type of things, like that sometimes you saw like in 80s music videos, and you know, where everything's like posterized. So it did have that. So it's kind of cheesy, but not any more cheesy than like some other 1983 things. And honestly, this, I mean, considering this was 83, they didn't really make, like I said, they didn't really make a lot of American folk horror films. I feel like a lot of American folk horror films were either set somewhere else, like set in Europe, or they were more like in the kind of Haitian voodoo type of area, which, you know, is also folk horror. So you don't really see a lot of folk horror films, like American folk horror films, set in the during the colonial period, like the pre-Revolutionary War period. And I think that was like a really cool idea. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of remakes, but I would be really interested to see somebody remake this, because it's a great idea for a story. I really, really like the kind of lore behind it. I like that it was set in a time period that you don't see a lot of horror films set in, and I think that was really cool. So I'd be curious to see like a modern filmmaker's take on it, particularly somebody like Robert Eggers or somebody like that who's really into folk horror. I kind of feel like it would be cool to see someone like that kind of take a whack at this story and see what they could do with it. Because like I said, all the ideas are there, and most of this is like really good. Like I said, the pacing is kind of strange. The acting is sort of, not that good, like in some cases, but there's still like a really cool, like compelling story in there that you could really do something with like nowadays. So let me know if you saw this back in the day. I know some people did, because I looked up, there's not a huge number of reviews of this on YouTube, but I did find a couple reviews out of guys who were, my age or a little bit younger, that had actually seen it on VHS back in, the mid to late 80s and remembered it fondly. And so some people did see it back then. I did not. Like I said, I might have seen it in the video store, but I just never rented it for whatever reason. But then it just kind of like disappeared for a really long time. But it has been rediscovered and restored, and is part of Severin's limited edition box set. But if you don't want to pay the money, I don't know how much that is. I'm assuming it's very expensive, because it comes with like a bunch of stuff. But you can actually watch this on Shudder at the moment. You might be able to like rent it other places too, because I'm assuming, because they just released it on Blu-ray, then usually you can get it on streaming services too. I think you can get it on Roku and stuff like that. But I watched it on Shudder, and it's definitely cool, definitely worth watching if you're into folk horror. And so let me know if you've seen it, and if you've seen it, what you thought about it. And that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. Our folk horror February continues, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.